How does it work? Let's take PepsiCo as an example. It is the parent company of many soda companies and snack companies. The so-called competitive brands are from factories from a few corporations who monopolize the entire industry. In the packaged food industry, there are a few big companies, like Unilever, the Coca-Cola company, Mondelez and Nestlé. In the picture you see that most brands in the food industry belong to one of these corporations. The big companies are on the stock market and have the big shareholders in the board of directors. On sources like Yahoo Finance, we can see detailed company info such as who the biggest shareholders actually are. Let's take PepsiCo again as an example. We see about 72% of stock is owned by no less than 3,155 institutional investors. These are investment companies, investment funds, insurance companies, banks, and in some cases governments. Who are the biggest institutional investors of PepsiCo? As you can see, only 10 of the investors own together nearly 1/3 of the stock. The top 10 of investors together amount to a value of $59 billion. But out of those 10, only 3 own more stock than the other 7. Let's remember them and look up who owns the most stocks of the Coca-Cola company, the biggest competitor of Pepsi. The biggest lump of stock is again owned by institutional investors. Let's look at the top 10 and start at the bottom 6 of them. 4 of these institutional investors we also saw at the bottom 6 of PepsiCo. These are Northern Trust, JP Morgan Chase, Geode Capital Management and Wellington Management. Now let's look at the 4 biggest stock owners. They are BlackRock, Vanguard and State Street. These are the world's biggest investment firms, so PepsiCo and Coca-Cola are not competitors at all. The other big companies that own a myriad of brand names like Unilever, Mondelez and Nestlé are from the same small group of investors. But it's not only in the food industry that their names come up. Let's find out on Wikipedia which are the biggest tech companies. Facebook is the owner of WhatsApp and Instagram. Together with Twitter, they form the most popular social media platforms. Alphabet is the parent of all Google companies like YouTube and Gmail. But they are also the biggest investor in Android, one of the 2 operating systems for nearly all smartphones and tablets. The other operating system is Apple's iOS. If we add Microsoft to the above 3, we see 4 companies making the software for nearly all computers, tablets and smartphones in the world. Let's see who are the biggest shareholders of these companies. Take Facebook. We see that 80% of the stock is owned by institutional investors. These are the same names that came up in the food industry. The same investors are in the top 3. Next is Twitter. It forms with Facebook and Instagram the top 3. Surprisingly, this company is in the hands of the same investors as well. We see them again with Apple and even with their biggest competitor, Microsoft. Also, if we look at other big companies in the tech industry that develop and make our computers, TVs, phones and home appliances, we see the same big investors that together own the majority of the stock. It's true for all industries, I'm not exaggerating. One last example. Let's book a holiday. On our computer or smartphone, we search for a flight to a sunny country on Skyscanner or Expedia. Both are from the same small group of investors. We fly with one of the many airlines, many of which are in the hands of the same investors and of governments, as is the case with Air France-KLM. The plane we board is in most cases a Boeing or an Airbus, also owned by the same names. We book through Booking.com or Airbnb, and when we arrive we go out for dinner and place a comment on TripAdvisor. The same big investors show up in every aspect of our trip. And their power is even bigger because of the kerosene is from their oil companies or refineries. The steel from which the plane is made comes from their mining companies. This small group of investment firms and funds and banks are namely also the biggest investors in the industry that dig for raw materials. Wikipedia shows that the biggest mining companies have the same big investors that we see everywhere. Also the big agricultural businesses on which the entire food industry depends. They own Bayer, the parent company of Monsanto, the biggest seed producer in the world. But they are also the shareholders of the big textile industry. And even many popular fashion brands who make the clothing out of the cotton are owned by the same investors. Whether we look at the world's biggest solar panel companies or oil refineries, the stocks are in the hands of the same companies. They own the tobacco companies that produce all the popular tobacco brands. But they also own all big pharmaceutical companies and the scientific institutions that produce medicine. They own the companies that produce our metals and also the entire car, plane and weapon industry, where a great deal of the metals and raw materials are used. They own the companies that build our electronics, they own the big warehouses and online markets, and even the means of payment we use to buy their products. To make this video as short as possible, I only showed you the tip of the iceberg. If you decide to research this with the sources I just showed you, then you will see that most popular insurance companies, banks, construction companies, telephone companies, restaurant chains and cosmetics are owned by the same institutional investors we have just seen. These institutional investors are mainly investment firms, banks and insurance companies. In turn, they themselves are owned by shareholders, and the most surprising thing is that they own each other's stocks. Together they form an immense network comparable to a pyramid. The smaller investors are owned by larger investors. Those are owned by even bigger investors. The visible top of this pyramid shows only two companies whose names we have often seen by now. They are Vanguard and BlackRock. The power of these two companies is beyond your imagination. Not only do they own a large part of the stocks of nearly all big companies, but also the stocks of the investors in those companies. This gives them a complete monopoly. A Bloomberg report states that both these companies in the year 2028 together will have investments in the amount of $20 trillion. That means that they will own almost anything. Bloomberg calls BlackRock the fourth branch of government because it's the only private agency that closely works with the central banks. BlackRock lends money to the central bank, but it's also the advisor. It also developed the software the central bank uses. Many BlackRock employees were in the White House with Bush and Obama. Its CEO Larry Fink can count on a warm welcome from leaders and politicians. Not so strange if you know that he is the frontman of the ruling company. But Larry Fink does not pull the strings himself. BlackRock itself is also owned by shareholders. Who are those shareholders? We come to a strange conclusion. The biggest shareholder is Vanguard. But now it gets murky. Vanguard is a private company and we cannot see who the shareholders are. The elite who own Vanguard apparently do not like being in the spotlights. But of course they cannot hide from who is willing to dig. Reports from Oxfam and Bloomberg say that 1% of the world together owns more money than the other 99%. Even worse, Oxfam says that 82% of all earned money in 2017 went to this 1%. Forbes, the most famous business magazine, says that in March 2020 there were 2,095 billionaires in the world. This means that Vanguard is owned by the richest families in the world. If we research their history, we see that they have always been the wealthiest, some of them even before the start of the Industrial Revolution. Because their history is so interesting and extensive, I will make a sequel. For now, I just want to say that these families, of whom many are in royalty, are the founders of our banking system and of every industry in the world. These families have never lost power, but due to an increasing population they had to hide behind firms like Vanguard, of which the stockholders are the private funds and non-profits of these families. To clarify the picture, I have to explain briefly what non-profits actually are. These appear to be the link between companies, politics and media. This conceals the conflicts of interests a bit. Non-profits, also called foundations, are dependent on donations. They do not have to disclose who their donors are. They can invest the money in the way they see fit and do not pay taxes as long as the profits are invested again in new projects. In this way, non-profits keep hundreds of billions of dollars among themselves. According to the Australian government, non-profits are an ideal way of financing terrorists and of massive money laundering. The foundations and funds of the families that are the richest stay in the background as much as possible. For issues that get much attention, the foundation of philanthropists are used that are lower in rank but very rich. I want to keep it short, so I will show you the three most important ones that connect all industries in the world. They are the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Open Society Foundation of the controversial multi-billionaire Soros, and the Clinton Foundation. I will give you a very short introduction to show you their power. According to the website of the World Economic Forum, the Gates Foundation is the biggest sponsor of the WHO. That was after Donald Trump quit USA financial support to the WHO in 2020. So the Gates Foundation is one of the most influential entities in everything that concerns our health. The Gates Foundation works closely with the biggest pharma companies, among which are Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, BioNTech and Bayer. And we have just seen who their biggest shareholders are. Bill Gates was not a poor computer nerd who miraculously became very rich. He's from a philanthropist family that works for the absolute elite. His Microsoft is owned by Vanguard, BlackRock and Berkshire Hathaway. But the Gates Foundation, after BlackRock and Vanguard, is the biggest shareholder in Berkshire Hathaway. He was even a member of the board there. We would need hours if we wanted to uncover everything in which Gates, the Open Society Foundation of Soros and the Clinton Foundation are involved. They form a bridge to the current situation, so I had to introduce them. We need to start the next topic with a question. Someone like me, who never makes videos, can with an old laptop objectively show that only 2 companies hold a monopoly in all industries in the world. My question is, why is this never talked about in the media? We can choose daily between all sorts of documentaries and TV programs, but none of them cover this subject. Is it not interesting enough? Or are there other interests at play? Wikipedia again gives us the answer. They say that about 90% of the international media is owned by 9 media conglomerates. Whether we take the monopolists Netflix and Amazon Prime, or enormous concerns that own many daughter companies like Time Warner, the Walt Disney Company, Comcast, Fox Corporations, Bertelsmann and Viacom CBS, we see that the same names own the stocks. These corporations not only make all the programs, movies and documentaries, but also own the channels on which those are broadcast. So not only the industries, but also the information is owned by the elite. I will show you briefly how this works in the Netherlands. To start with, all the Dutch mainstream media are owned by 3 companies. The first one is the Persgroep, the parent company of the following brands. Apart from the many newspapers and magazines, they also own Sanoma, the parent company of some of the big commercial Dutch channels. Many media outlets from abroad, like VTM, are also owned by the Persgroep. The second one is Mediahuis, one of Europe's biggest media concerns. In the Netherlands, Mediahuis owns the following brands. Until 2017, also Sky Radio and Radio Veronica were owned by Mediahuis, as were Radio 538 and Radio 10. And then there's Bertelsmann, which is one of the 9 biggest media firms. This company owns RTL, that owns 45 television stations and 32 radio stations in 11 countries. But Bertelsmann is also co-owner of the world's biggest book publisher, Penguin Random House. The stocks of these companies are owned by private funds of 3 families. Those are the Belgian Van Tillo family, the Belgian Leysen family and the German Bertelsmann Moon family. All three families sided with the Nazis in the war, according to Wikipedia. For this reason, the Telegraaf, the licensed newspaper, was temporarily forbidden in the Netherlands after the war. To complete this overview, look at where the news comes from. The daily news of all these media outlets, the diverse news media, do not produce news. They use information and footage from the press agencies ANP and Reuters. These agencies are not independent. ANP is owned by Talpa, John de Mol. Thomson Reuters is owned by the powerful Canadian Thomson family. The most important journalists and editors working for these agencies are a member of a journalism agency like the European Journalism Centre. These are one of the biggest European sponsors of media-related projects. They educate journalists, publish study books, provide training spaces and press agencies, and work closely together with the big corporations Google and Facebook. For journalistic analysis and views, the big media use Project Syndicate. This is the most powerful organization in the field. Project Syndicate and organizations like I mentioned are together with the press agencies the link between all worldwide media outlets. When news anchors read from their audio cues, chances are that the text stems from one of these organizations. That is the reason that worldwide media shows synchronicity in their reporting.
One-sided news stories
plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.